So first, we'll hear from someone who's been on the ground floor of critical thinking for more than 30 years, who's internationally recognized for his foundational work in the field, and whose name is known pretty much everywhere critical thinking is discussed. Please join me in welcoming Richard Paul.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here for the 31st year of my involvement in critical thinking. But I'd like to take you back in time to Lafayette Elementary School in Chicago so many years ago, just after the end of the Second World War. I had my first teacher who was fostering critical thinking, though she didn't know she was. Mrs. Finucane. Mrs. Finucane was devoted to grammar and to the need, she thought, for every student to think grammatically and to be able to take any sentence and analyze its structure. And what made her teaching unique and in line with critical thinking is it was based on a systematic analysis of the language, and she immediately took us into the heart of the logic of the content. And this was the individual statement. Every locution, every time you express yourself in sentences, the same structures are at work. For example, she would say, look for two things in every sentence. One, what is it speaking of? And two, what is it saying? Look for these two structures. Then notice if you take the subject and the predicate, you can focus on the subject and qualify it. We call these adjectives. And you can take the predicate and see what adjusts it and its meaning, which we call adverbs. And so we were taught to think systematically and analytically about English sentences and to realize that every word is playing some role in the logic of what we construct in English or in whatever language we're speaking in. Her devotion to this and her ability to get urban youngsters to think analytically, systematically in this one domain became a kind of paradigm for me. I looked for systems then in my other subjects. Unfortunately, my other subjects were not taught systematically. They were not taught. Instructors didn't come in and say, look, I know you're not familiar with chemistry, or I know you're not familiar with biology, but there is a logic here, a system. And if you go to the heart of the system, you'll understand the foundation for that logic, and everything else will build on that foundation. So look for a foundation, then look for everything to fit into that foundation, so that what you're learning is a way of thinking within the content, thinking chemically, thinking like a physicist, thinking in a literary fashion. And so, in high school, a large urban high school, I looked for something equivalent to the system behind the subject for 4 years, and no one taught that way. But then I went to a community college, Bryant Community College in Chicago, and my first instructor that I remember was a math instructor. And she came in and she said on the first day, none of you know how to think mathematically, but in my class, you are going to, and this is the way we'll do it. Every formula we study, you will not be allowed to apply to specific cases unless you can explain the formula to me in ordinary English. And so we would stream up to her desk, and she would ask us questions. So we wouldn't just take a formula or a procedure and apply it without being able to explain what we were doing. Math was translated in her class into ordinary English every day. And so this took me back to Mrs. Finucane, and the system was once again stimulated. And as luck would have it, I had, shortly after the math instructor, I had an instructor who, in English, who introduced each of us to reading and writing and the logic of reading and writing. So let's take reading. This person, by the way, was a student of Mortimer Adler's and from the University of Chicago. And they were, at that time, in the heyday of the Great Books program. And the idea was, if you could read well, you can get an education by simply having access to a library that is a good library. If only you know the logic of reading. And so, in this class, we would read a text, and then we would explain what we read to each other. And as we had to re-articulate the text, put it into ordinary English, we were doing something very much akin to what was happening in the math class. So the instructor, whose name I've long forgotten, was teaching us how to do what I call close reading. We would take passages and we would read them, and then we would give voice to them and have to explain them. And the kinds of questions that would be asked is, okay, in this paragraph, what is the main point that is made? And answer, blah, blah, blah. Okay. In other words, now could you elaborate and explain that to me? Okay. Now could you give me an example from your life in which something like this applies? State, elaborate, and exemplify. So we learned how to digest a text, to read it closely, to get the essence of it, the main meaning, and then see how everything tied into that main meaning. And in doing that, we developed, at least those of us who took the course seriously, we developed into decent readers. And if you're a good reader, amongst the many things you can read are textbooks. And so I read the textbook in the analytic way I was taught to read every text by my English teacher. And that meant that I looked for the system, I looked for the foundational ideas, I looked for how everything tied together, I expected a system to be there, and now, through analytic close reading, I found that system. With those tools, I could now go into a classroom and learn in an effective way, because I was digesting the textbook through the reading process and giving voice to its logic. I found then that it was easy to pass tests because teachers didn't really expect you to learn in this way. They just wanted you to, or seemingly, wanted you to repeat back what they said. But what you learn then is to be an independent learner, and if you're looking for a system, you'll have some questions, and so your hand will go up frequently. And those teachers who were sensitive to the educational process would know that that articulation was essential for your intellectual growth. Now, at this point in time, I'm a freshman at Wright Junior College in Chicago. At that particular time, no one has uttered the words critical thinking in the classroom that I remember. Could have been mentioned, but it wasn't meaningfully brought in a conscious fashion. Analytic reading is a form of critical thinking, but there are many other analytic forms of thought which are parts of critical thinking that were not included in analytic reading. And so in comparison to the students who hadn't learned to read analytically, I scored higher on most exams than most other students because I was digesting the text. They were memorizing the text. And someone who understands learns much better than someone who simply parrots. And so I wasn't going to be a parrot, and I found a great pleasure in giving the essence of the text, the essence of the paragraph, the essence of the chapter, the essence of today, the essence of this or that dimension, and to feel that I could break down texts into essential ideas. So with just a little bit of critical thinking, without explicit command of the elements which you will be exposed to, without explicit exposure to the standards, nevertheless, I was beginning to think critically, and that meant that I began to pull away from the rest of the students and score higher. As a result of this growing ability, my test scores went shooting up. And I received a scholarship from the University of Southern California as a result of my test scores, my grade point average, and my success. But this is a success which didn't automatically spread to the other students. It was possible to go through and not learn this, even though some of the teachers were, in fact, cultivated. So you may be teaching for critical thinking in this implicit fashion, in this quiet fashion. And for some of the students, they will learn because of you and because of what you're cultivating in them. But it also means that if it's like my experience, the vast majority won't get it. they won't get the system. They won't be looking for essential ideas. They will not be looking for occasions to give voice to what they're learning. They will simply try to remember for the quiz, for the test, the answers which presumably came in the lecture. So, though it's possible to teach for critical thinking in this quiet, unpublic way, nevertheless, you're not going to get the big payoff, which comes when you name it for what it is and say to your students, in my class, you will be thinkers, and you will use a certain kind of thinking called critical thinking, and I'm going to help you understand how to take apart any line of thought. I will show you how you can reduce the text to fundamental ideas, and you will practice in my class, thinking chemically, if it's a chemistry class, thinking biologically, thinking architecturally, thinking like a professional nurse, thinking like each of these forms of thinking would be front and forward. And we would be explicit about what we expected out of the thinking of our students. So wherever you are in this continuum of relationship to your students via critical thinking, whether you do it implicitly or you do it explicitly, you can up the ante and take it to a higher level by making it more and more explicit and showing students how easy it is ultimately to create knowledge if you know the structures out of which knowledge is constructed. And hopefully that's what you will be exposed to in your sessions at the conference. And then you can bring these ideas back into the classroom. No one is a perfect thinker. Critical thinking will not make you perfect. But what it will do is make you a powerful decoder of content, a powerful digester of meaning, an articulate spokesman for what you're learning, a questioning attitude, a seeking to answer the same fundamental questions that open up knowledge for anyone who would learn in a deep fashion. So that's a little bit about me and about my early experience with the phenomenon of school and the wonderful gift that I received from those teachers who taught in this special way.